kicks. I sit and look at 'em by the hour. This is a world of ups and it's a world of downs. Why, he'd set there and eat crackers out of a box and apples out of a barrel and pitch his cores into the street. And now he's a lord a livin' in a castle. Them's a lord's kicks. They'll be an earl's kicks some day. Sometimes I says to myself, says I, 'Well, I'll be jiggered.'" He seemed to derive a great deal of comfort from his reflections and Dick's visit. Before Dick went home, they had a supper in the small back room. They had crackers and cheese and sardines and other canned things out of the store. And Mr. Hobbs solemnly opened 2 bottles of ginger ale, and, pouring out 2 glasses, proposed a toast. "Here's to him," he said, lifting his glass, "and may he teach 'em a lesson, earls and markises and dukes and all." After that night, the two saw each other often, and Mr. Hobbs was much more comfortable and less desolate. They read the Penny Story Gazette and many other interesting things, and gained a knowledge of the habits of the nobility and gentry which would have surprised those despised classes if they had realized it. One day Mr. Hobbs made a pilgrimage to a bookstore downtown, for the express purpose of adding to their library. He went to the clerk and leaned over the counter to speak to him. "I want," he said, "a book about earls." "What?" exclaimed the clerk. "A book," repeated the groceryman, "about earls." "I'm afraid," said the clerk, looking rather queer, "that we haven't what you want." "Haven't?" said Mr. Hobbs anxiously. "Well, say markises, then, or dukes." "I know of no such book," answered the clerk. Mr. Hobbs was much disturbed. He looked down on the floor. Then he looked up. "None about female earls?" he inquired. "I'm afraid not," said the clerk with a smile. "Well!" exclaimed Mr. Hobbs, "I'll be jiggered." He was just going out of the store when the clerk called him back and asked him if a story in which the nobility were chief characters would do. Mr. Hobbs said it would, if he could not get an entire volume devoted to earls. So the clerk sold him a book called The Tower of London, written by Mr. Harrison Ainsworth, and he carried it home. When Dick came, they began to read it. It was a very wonderful and exciting book, and the scene was laid in the reign of the famous English Queen who is called by some people Bloody Mary. And as Mr. Hobbs heard of Queen Mary's deeds and the habit she had of chopping people's heads off, putting them to the torture, and burning them alive, he became very much excited. He took his pipe out of his mouth and stared at Dick, and at last he was obliged to mop the perspiration from his brow with his red pocket-handkerchief. "Why, he ain't safe," he said. "He ain't safe. If the women folks can sit up on their thrones and give the word for things like that to be done, who's to know what's happening to him this very minute? He's no more safe than nothing. Just let a woman like that get mad, and no one's safe." "Well," said Dick, though he looked rather anxious himself, "you see this here 'un isn't the one that's bossin' things now. I know her name's Victory, and this 'un here in the book, her name's Mary." "So it is," said Mr. Hobbs, still mopping his forehead. "So it is. And the newspapers are not saying anything about any racks, thumbscrews, or stake burnin's. But still, it doesn't seem as if it was safe for him over there with those queer folks. Why, they tell me they don't keep the 4th of July." He was privately uneasy for several days, and it was not until he received Fauntleroy's letter and had read it several times, both to himself and to Dick, and had also read the letter Dick got about the same time, that he became composed again. But they both found great pleasure in their letters. They read and reread them, and talked them over, and enjoyed every word of them. And they spent days over the answers they sent, and read them over almost as often as the letters they had received. It was rather a labor for Dick to write his. All his knowledge of reading and writing he had gained during a few months when he had lived with his elder brother, and had gone to a night school. But, being a sharp boy, he had made the most of that brief education, and had spelled out things in newspapers since then, and practice writing with bits of chalk on pavements, or walls, or fences. He told Mr. Hobbs all about his life, and about his elder brother, who had been rather good to him after their mother died, when Dick was quite a little fellow. Their father had died some time before. The brother's name was Ben, and he had taken care of Dick as well as he could, until the boy was old enough to sell newspapers and run errands. They had lived together, and as he grew older, Ben had managed to get along until he had quite a decent place in a store. "And then," exclaimed Dick with disgust, "blest if he didn't go and marry a gal. Just went and got spoony and hadn't any more sense left. Married her and set up housekeeping in 2 back rooms. And a hefty un she was. A regular tiger cat. She'd tear things to pieces when she got mad. And she was mad all the time. Had a baby just like her. Yelled day and night. And if I didn't have to tend it, and when it screamed, she'd fire things at me. She fired a plate at me one day and hit the baby, cut its chin. Doctor said he'd carry the mark till he died. A nice mother she was. Cracky. But didn't we have a time, Ben and myself and the young un. She was mad at Ben because he didn't make money faster, and at last he went out west with a man to set up a cattle ranch. And hadn't been gone a week, for one night I got home from selling my papers, and the rooms was locked up and empty. And the woman of the house, she told me Minna had gone. Shown a clean pair of heels. Someone else said she'd gone across the water, to be a nuss to a lady as had a little baby too. Never heard a word of her since. Nother has Ben. If I'd have been him, I wouldn't have fretted a bit, and I guess he didn't. But he thought a heap of her at the start. Tell you, he was spoons on her. She was a daisy-looking gal, too, when she was dressed up and not mad. She'd big black eyes and black hair down to her knees. She'd make it into a rope as big as your arm and twist it round and round her head, and I tell you, her eyes'd snap. Folks used to say she was part Italian. Said her mother or father'd come from there, and it made her queer. I tell you, she was one of 'em, she was." He often told Mr. Hobbs stories of her, and of his brother Ben, who, since his going out west, had written once or twice to Dick. Ben's luck had not been good, and he had wandered from place to place, but at last he had settled on a ranch in California, where he was at work at the time when Dick became acquainted with Mr. Hobbs. "That gal," said Dick one day, "she took all the grit out of him. I couldn't help feeling sorry for him sometimes." They were sitting in the store doorway together, and Mr. Hobbs was filling his pipe. "He oughtn't to have married," he said solemnly, as he rose to get a match. "Women! I never could see any use in 'em myself." As he took the match from its box, he stopped and looked down on the counter. "Why," he said, "if here isn't a letter! I didn't see it before. The postman must have laid it down when I wasn't noticin', or the newspaper slipped over it." He picked it up and looked at it carefully. "It's from him!" he exclaimed. "That's the very one it's from." He forgot his pipe altogether. He went back to his chair quite excited, and took his pocket-knife and opened the envelope. "I wonder what news there is this time," he said. And then he unfolded the letter and read as follows: "Dorincourt Castle. My dear Mr. Hobbs, I write this in a great hurry because I have something curious to tell you. I know you will be very much surprised, my dear friend, when I tell you. It's all a mistake, and I am not a lord, and I shall not have to be an earl. There is a lady which was married to my Uncle Bevis, who is dead, and she has a little boy, and he is Lord Fauntleroy, because that is the way it is in England. The earl's eldest son's little boy is the earl if everybody else is dead. I mean if his father and grandfather are dead. My grandfather is not dead, but my Uncle Bevis is, and so his boy is Lord Fauntleroy, and I am not, because my papa was the youngest son, and my name is Cedric Errol like it was when I was in New York, and all the things will belong to the other boy. I thought at first I should have to give him my pony and cart, but my grandfather says I need not. My grandfather is very sorry, and I think he does not like the lady, but P'raps he thinks Dearest and I are sorry because I